Hello everyone, welcome to Eorzea Armoire, a series about the background of some of Heidelin's more epic and dense weapons, armor, and artifacts. We'll be investigating the lore of these items both within Final Fantasy XIV and the Final Fantasy franchise in general, as well as the amazing and sometimes obscure real-world people, events, and artifacts upon which they are based. In Europe, and in every part of the world where learning had impressed the human soul, astrology reigned supreme until the middle of the 17th century. It entered into the councils of princes, it guided the policy of nations, and ruled the daily actions of individuals. All this is attested by the records of every nation which has a history. The Greco-Egyptian Ptolemy's collection of work on the movements and influence of the heavens illuminates principles that are distilled into the ideas and writing of every significant Western thinker from well before his own time, indeed as far back as the pre-Socratic philosophers, and were not seriously challenged before Copernicus started rolling a ball in the 16th century that would begin to pick up speed and momentum about 80 years later. Ptolemy's Almagest is an observational treatise on astronomy, and the Tetrabiblos explores the art of horoscopic astrology as practical conjecture of the effects of heavenly bodies and their movements as described in the Almagest upon the world and the human subject. The immediate question around which much of this video will revolve is why we should have the works of Ptolemaic astrology in the hands of the scholar and not the astrologian, and I'm not going to accept simply because it's a book as an answer. We've explored in previous installments, particularly our episode on the Veil of Yu, the way that arcanists, summoners, and scholars use divine geometry to weave spells of far greater precision and complexity than, say, the bursts of raw elements produced by a black mage. This is because mathematics, and particularly geometry, is a pure representation of the structures of the ethereal realm, as opposed to other clumsy and imprecise representations such as describing it with language or merely observing its effects. This is a theory inspired by Platonic realism, in which universals exist independently of particular forms. A physical apple is an imperfect simulacrum of noumenal applehood, which might seem ridiculous, but it is the basis for mathematical Platonism. To put it simply, this is the belief that abstract mathematical objects like numbers and sets exist independently of our thoughts and practices. This has two interesting consequences. First, that although when we describe something with language, we are always creating something, when we describe something with mathematics, there is no creation, only discovery. There is absolutely nothing superfluous. Secondly, it is predicated by the fact that something can exist abstractly and independently of the spatio-temporal order of things that can be observed. In other words, there must be some kind of noumenal order of things. In Heidelin's case, this noumenal order is the ethereal realm of proto-energy and matter, the life stream. Ptolemy's work, on the other hand, is concerned with how we might supplement and synthesize mathematical knowledge with observation, and by so doing reach a greater understanding of the divine and its effects, which, once modeled, can be used to predict anything from weather and natural disaster to economics and wars, and be used to explain not only seasons but also human nature and even ethnic stereotypes. These are the kinds of predictive powers that we know to have been ever sought on Heidelin by the Thalassocratic arcanists and the Nemean and Charlean scholars alike, regardless of their own more traditional Platonism when it comes to pursuing knowledge. We'll see that although we spent most of our job quests in both A Realm Reborn and Heavensward pursuing the Nemean scholarly traditions, we're learning more and more about the discretions of their Charlean equivalents. The models that Ptolemy produces should be familiar to us. Once we observe that heavenly bodies seem to rotate more or less consistently around the Earth, and that half of the stars in the firmament are above the horizon and half below, we posit that our world is at the center of creation, and we begin to draw a geocentric model of the cosmos. We then import into this model our understanding of the base elements, fire, air, water, and earth in Ptolemy's case, and attribute them to various parts of the celestial spheres and the stars therein, based on our observations that certain weather effects happen more often, or people tend to behave in a certain way under these signs that corresponds to a certain element. We could honestly talk about this all day, but the essential part is that the scholar's Anima weapon is very clearly a supplementary text to the core knowledge of a Charlean astrologian. The scholar gains power as it gains knowledge, just as the summoner has developed by studying the Draconomicon, a tome that would initially seem more valuable to a dragoon than anyone else. So too has the scholar apparently thought to expand their syllabus, hungry for knowledge with any practical or predictive utility, and not just that of mathematical realism. From a law perspective, any Charlean scholar worth their salt will have studied astronomy as closely as history, mathematics, or any of the so-called ethereal sciences. Both Ptolemy and the Charlean astrologians describe astrology as essentially applied astronomy. The Tetrabiblos applies the lessons and principles of the Almagest. So if the Almagest is a book of scientific astronomy, but the Tetrabiblos expounds almost entirely on the art of horoscopic speculation, why is the scholar not wielding the Almagest instead? The fact that the scholar's Anima weapon takes the form of a Tetrabiblos assumes that our Warrior of Light has either already begun to master the basics of the astrologian job, or else that they did in fact take out some loans from the Google library and spend more time in tutelage with the Archons, Matoya, the Leveilleur twins, or Kryl than we have realized. Basically, we have since A Realm Reborn undertaken something of a Charlean education. It makes sense that for the Charlean scholar, the foundational knowledge of the astrologian is complementary and complicit, and that Charlean astrologians are simply scholars that have decided to specialize in this particular field and forego the broader discipline of our tome-wielding scholar. We have already noticed how much the kinds of diagrams produced by and subsequent to Ptolemaic geocentrism closely resemble the star globes wielded by the astrologian. It is my belief that the more active and easily manipulated three-dimensional representation of the heavenly spheres is preferred by the astrologian, because everything they need to know is at a glance and in far greater detail than a couple of diagrams could afford. Their scope is much narrower, but also much more focused, and this form evidently lends itself well to the discipline. It is all they need. On the other hand, the tome form of the Tetrabiblos describes the movements of the heavenly spheres in a way that is more palatable to a scholar, with detailed diagrams and divine geometry. Whilst the astrologian is more concerned with predicting the fates of men and challenging the ether of the stars themselves, I would assume that the scholar's interest in this compendium of astrology is that it allows them to predict the bigger picture. Things like weather events and movements of ethereal currents influenced by the stars across the field of battle, which allows them to adjust the way they implement the techniques that they have already mastered with greater effect. The pages of the tome allow plenty of space for hypotheticals, commentaries, referential material, and so forth. For the astrologian, astrology is everything. For the scholar, it is another valuable work to add to the library of knowledge that ever allows them to predict, diagnose, and manipulate the threads of reality with greater and greater potency. From a meta perspective, the development and localization staff are probably trying to tell all of you scholars to go and level Astrologian. Give it a try, see if you can't at least pick up some tips and tricks that will help your healing game across the board. So there's a very astrology-centric installment for the Scholar's Anima weapon. If you're a scholar currently feeling unloved, then go take it up with Koji Fox, but honestly, I think that knowing almost as much about astrology as an astrologian should make you feel pretty badass. As always, like and subscribe, comment below with your thoughts, feel free to share with your friends in-game or across social media. If there's anything you'd like me to cover in this series that is specifically not an Anima weapon, then feel free to leave a request, and until next time, thank you so much for watching. I'm Ethys, and this has been Eorzea Armoire.